not enough to teach what Jesus taught. We need to teach how Jesus taught. Jesus' teaching was amazing, and it is possible to bore people with the gospel. In fact, people all do it all the time. In my first book that sold any copies to speak of, You Can Double Your Class in 2 Years or Less, I talk about the fact that we have to have at least halfway decent teaching each and every week, nothing less will do. And we're shooting for a higher standard here of teaching like Jesus. My point in that book was you actually don't have to teach like Jesus. You don't have to be incredible to double a Sunday school class. Now, the better the teaching, the more likely the growth. We actually have research on that. But teaching even a halfway decent lesson can cause a group to grow if you do some other things, and I talk about that in the other book. But in the course of teaching that material, I ask a number of the groups, how many of you would say the teachers that you have experienced over the years drop below the bar of just even halfway decent? They weren't even halfway decent teaching. Now, as I got responses from that question, the numbers varied quite a bit. Some people, one person said, I've never had a bad Sunday school teacher. I never had a Sunday school teacher, Bible study teacher that was not at least halfway decent. And somebody else said to me one time, I've never had a Bible study teacher that I thought was halfway decent. So the numbers varied widely. But as I asked that question to a number of groups, the averages that came in all averaged about the same, and that was about a third. About a third of our Bible study teachers dropped below the bar of not even being halfway decent teachers. And we want to aspire to teach like Jesus, and a lot of us are not even halfway decent teaching. I talked to a pastor yesterday who was a new pastor at a church and sat in on one of his Sunday school classes, and he said it was awful. It was boring. People are looking at their watches. People are looking out the window. They're looking at their shoes. It's awful. And I say that is terrible. It is a sin. It is a shame. It is a crime to take the greatest news ever to hit planet Earth. Do you love being a follower of Christ? I love being a follower of Christ. And I want to present it in such a way that people get the idea that this is significant, that this is interesting, that this is worthy of giving a little bit of time and attention to. And I want you to do the same thing. You think about Jesus' teaching. He didn't do any advertising, or Jesus' ministry, Jesus didn't do any advertising. He didn't send out any flyers. He didn't hire any heralds to say, hear ye, Jesus is coming to town. I don't think he had an outreach strategy, best I can tell. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I think you should have an outreach strategy, but best I can tell, Jesus didn't have an outreach strategy. He didn't follow up on his prospects. When people would come and visit his meetings, I don't think he took lists and took down names and took down email addresses. I'm again, not saying you shouldn't. I think you should, and I think you should follow up on your prospects. And I think you ought to give Friday nights to Jesus and invite him into your home and love them in common, ordinary, pedestrian ways. And my research has shown that in 90% of the cases, if I can get them into my home and share my coffee cake with them, they'll join my church. And I think you ought to do that. I think you ought to do some follow-up on some prospects. But to be fair, Jesus didn't do that. He didn't contact absentees. When people would come to his meetings for a while and then they'd quit coming, he didn't call them up and say, or look them up and say, hey, I hadn't seen you in my meetings for a while. I don't think that necessarily is an example for us to follow per se. I think you ought to contact absentees. In fact, I could make a biblical base for that. We're not going to get into that today, but I think you ought to contact absentees. But to be fair, I don't think Jesus did. He didn't do any visitation. He didn't go out on Monday nights and try to drum up business for his meetings. And I'm not saying you shouldn't. In fact, my research indicates that churches that are involved in visitations, could be classes, groups that are involved in visitation, are about 70% more likely to be growing when compared with groups that don't. So visitation has a positive impact on the growth of your class. But to be fair, Jesus didn't do any visitation. He didn't do anything to promote his meetings. And yet, he didn't do any marketing. And yet, Jesus had incredible crowds. Jesus did tell people not to. He did something I've never heard anybody in any church ever do. Have you? He said, now keep this meeting on the down low. Don't tell anybody about this meeting. Have you ever heard anybody in any church ever say that to anybody? No, we want bigger and bigger crowds, and maybe that'd be a good idea. But to be fair, Jesus said, please don't tell anybody about what we've done here. He seemed to prefer the small group over the crowd. And Robert Coleman, in his classic book, The Master Plan of Evangelism, I'd strongly encourage you to read, talks about this, talks about how when Jesus would get a crowd, and the crowds would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then he would violate what John Maxwell calls the law of the big mo, the law of momentum. And that is, the idea is that when momentum is on your side, it just makes everything a little easier. And momentum would start to get on Jesus' side and be crowds and crowds and crowds, and then he'd just leave the crowds and he'd go off into the hill somewhere and pray and spend some time with his disciples. You think about the greatest sermon ever preached, which would be the Sermon on the Mount. Now let's think about this. If you were to preach the greatest sermon to ever be preached, who would you want to preach that sermon to? I'd want to get me a crowd. I'd have waited till this generation, for starters, and I'd get on satellite, I'd get on the internet, I'd get on radio and TV, I'd send it out on blogs and podcasts and whatever I could do, and I'd record it and duplicate it and so on, so on, so on. The greatest sermon ever preached, the text clearly said, and Jesus saw the crowds, and he went up on the hill, and the implication is he left the crowds. And he sat down, and people make a big deal about why did Jesus sit down? Well, I'll tell you why I think he sat down is because it's the most natural thing in the world to do when you're teaching a group of 12 people. And Jesus, one of his primary ministries was that of small group leader. He tended to prefer that small group. He realized disciples are made in a circle, as Andy Stanley says it, rather than in straight rows. And he seemed to prefer that small group atmosphere. He seemed to sometimes avoid crowds. He'd get off by himself, and the crowds would build, and they'd be looking for him, and so on. And he seemed to kind of avoid the crowds. And yet, we got ahead of ourselves a moment ago, but yet Jesus had huge crowds. He did nothing to build his crowds. He didn't do any outreach. He didn't do any visitation. He didn't do any promotion. He didn't do any contact with absentees or contacts with recent visitors or so on. He told people not to tell. He avoided the crowds. He went off into the mountains. He preferred the small group, and yet he had huge crowds. Now, part of this, to be fair, had to do, I think, with his miracles. And I can't prove this because you can't run Jesus' life without the miracles, but I think even if Jesus had not done these amazing miracles, I think he still would have had amazing crowds. The people were just amazed at his teaching. And the big idea we want to learn from that is, again, it is not enough to teach what Jesus taught. We need to teach how Jesus taught. Would you say that with me? Ready? It is not enough to teach what Jesus taught. We need to teach how Jesus taught. We do not want to bore people with the gospel. I believe it is a sin to bore people with the gospel, to take the greatest news ever to hit planet Earth and present it in such a way that people get the idea it's not that significant, not that important, not worthy of giving a little bit of time and attention to. Truth be told, Jesus' teaching was amazing. Let's look at a few verses. Matthew 7:28. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Coming to his hometown, he began teaching the people in the synagogue, and they were amazed. Mark 1:22, the people were amazed at his teaching. Mark 1:27, the people were also amazed that they asked each other, what is this? A new teaching and with authority. And this word amazed, and a few other words that are translated this way, actually translate quite a wide variety of underlying Greek words that are all translated amazed. And it's like the writers of the Greek New Testament are just pulling out the thesaurus to try to find as many words as they can find to communicate this idea that Jesus' teaching was just astonishing, that people just sat there with their mouth open. And you look at this number of, this graph I put on the screen, this number of words that are all translated amazed. Another group of words that are translated astonished have a similar kind of approach, and you see there's quite a number of there. You don't need to know what they are. My only point is just to point out that when Jesus taught, I mean, just people went, wow, this is amazing. To put it another way, when Jesus taught, people went like this. And I've been in a lot of Sunday school classes and Bible study groups over the years, and small groups from time to time, and they don't look like this. Instead, they look like this. And I wonder how they look in your class. And I want you to learn to teach like Jesus. I heard someone talking about teaching kids one time. And one of the things we will not get to in this series was the idea that Jesus' teaching was amazing even for kids. And anyway, this teacher was talking about the fact, I was kind of challenging this group to say, I want our teaching to be amazing for kids. And this teacher said, well, why? It was boring when I went to Sunday school and when I was growing up, and I think they ought to have to put up with it as well. Well, Jesus' teaching was not that way. He was amazing to kids and amazing to adults and everyone in between. And our teaching often is just kind of blah, 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 word soup. And we got to do better. Remember the classic story I've told a number of times. If you heard other seminars I've done, you might have heard me tell this story. But sitting in the class, and the teacher was teaching from the King James Version, where the text refers to Judas, son of perdition, John 17. And he read the text, looked at the class, and he said, now, predestination. Who really understands that concept of predestination? And I looked at the word and I thought, this word is not predestination. This word is perdition. And if this guy had read one quarterly, a commentary, a teacher's book, a student book, or an entry out of the dictionary, he would have figured out the fact that this word is not perdition. Is not predestination. It is, in fact, perdition. My guess is that gentleman was looking at that text for the very first time that morning. Had a state Sunday school director say to me one time about attending a class he went to, and the teacher just passed out the quarterlies and said, would you read page 9? Would you read page 10? Would you read page 11? When we get over here to page 14, we'll close in prayer and we'll have prayer requests and we'll be done. That is a crime. That is a sin. We got to do better than that. We got the greatest news ever to hit planet Earth, the hope of mankind, the source of abundant living. And we need to teach it in a way that is not only what Jesus taught, but how Jesus taught. All right, I want to talk to you in this session. We're going to have 5 sessions in this session. This is just an introduction, and I hope you will get in a group and discuss this in a group, because Jesus, that's primarily how he taught. He taught in groups, and I want you to teach in groups. And I want to talk to you about how we can learn to teach like Jesus. And the first thing you can do is get in a group. You may have found this video on the web. I'm glad you did. But let me encourage you to get a group together. And maybe do it at church, maybe do it at your home or something. And for 5 weeks, get together and talk about, and I'm going to give you some questions for this week to talk about, but to talk about what does it mean to teach like Jesus? How did Jesus teach? And what observations can you make about Jesus' teaching? So discuss it as a group together. Read the Gospels. And this is pretty much how I wrote the book, is I read the Gospels, much as I could from the Greek New Testament, by the way, but at any rate, I read the Gospels, and with a view to not so much what Jesus is teaching, but how did Jesus teach? He was the best teacher who has ever lived, and how did he teach? And I would encourage you to try to discover this yourself, mine this information yourself, to read through the Gospels and ask yourself, what is Jesus' teaching technique? So read through the Gospels, and I would encourage you, humbly I would say, to read the book. My book, Teach Like Jesus. Truth be told, there are a number of good books. In fact, this one was recommended to me just recently, Jesus the Teacher by J.M. Price. It's an old out-of-print book, but you get it on Amazon pretty cheap, probably like I did. I haven't read that book yet, but they tell me it's a good one, and I plan to read it. And I would encourage you to do the same, to read my book, to read some other books. Just do a search on Amazon for Jesus and Teach, or Jesus and Preach, or How to Argue Like Jesus, or what a number of books that are out there like that. And so, and we encourage you to do some reading along those lines. And then, let me encourage you, most of all, to put it into practice. To take what you learned, and that's why I would encourage you not to watch these videos all at once. To watch them a week at a time, and then each week to talk about how, or try to implement, try to think, how can I put that principle into practice? We're going to talk about 4 things in this series. And let me encourage you each week, as we talk about each one of those things, to think about how we can put those things into practice. So here are some discussion questions you might go over as a group. Number 1, who was the best teacher you ever had? What made them good? Why were they the best teacher ever? What would you like to learn from that teacher? What good things come from good teaching? If we devote ourselves to teaching like Jesus, how will you benefit? How will your class, your group benefit? How will the church benefit? How will the kingdom of God benefit if we learn to teach like Jesus? And then, and by the way, these are kind of 2 classic questions I ask all the time about almost anything. If you're teaching about forgiveness, you might ask, what good things will happen if you forgive? What bad things will happen if you don't forgive? So essentially we're asking that here. What good things will happen if you learn to be a better and better teacher and teach like Jesus? And what's the cost if you don't? Is it a big deal? I think it's a huge deal that we have people in our Bible study groups that are just boring people. By the way, I think Sunday school in particular has a huge branding problem. And what I mean by that is, in the form of a question, how many times would you go to a restaurant where the service was really bad before you'd quit going? I remember going to a Waffle House one time, and I ordered an omelet, like I often do as I go to a breakfast restaurant. I ordered a bacon, cheese, mushroom omelet. and I got a bacon, cheese, mushroom, and rubber band omelet. The kind of rubber band that a gal might use to pull back her hair. And you know what? I've never been to Waffle House again because of a branding issue. That one bad experience. And people come to a Sunday school class one time where somebody passes around a book and says, would you read page 9? And they'll never come back again. It is a huge issue. And in about a third of our cases, according to the research that I've done, the teaching is not even halfway decent. Get that real clear in your mind. Turn to the person on your left. Turn to the person on your right. Think about this. One of those two people is boring. Actually, that's not exactly right. The truth is, it's a huge problem in our Bible studies that we have got boring Sunday school classes in some cases. But here's some good news. You know who your boring Sunday school teachers are? They're the ones that wouldn't come to this study. You invited them, didn't you? And now they won't come. You know why? They think they're good enough. They don't care about teaching like Jesus. And good for you that you do care about teaching like Jesus. Anyway, talk about what good things will happen, what good things come from great teaching, and what bad things. What is the cost? I think say one of the costs is kind of a branding issue. And then just brainstorm, think about some stories about the life of Jesus, and think what made him such a great teacher. I'm going to give you 4 things in the book. We got 14, but in this series we're going to do 4. But discuss this for a little bit. What do you think made Jesus such a great teacher? May God richly bless you as you seek to learn to teach as Jesus taught. Not only what Jesus taught, but as Jesus taught. And as you discuss this together, my heart's prayer is that you would learn to teach as Jesus taught.